Hi, guys. Today we are lucky enough to have the opportunity to talk with Mr. Cory Doctorow, a science fiction author and a journalist and an activist. I don't know if I left something behind, but just in case someone that is listening to us doesn't know you, Cory, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. Well, you've done a reasonably good job. I write science fiction novels, among other things. I've written more than 30 books. They run the gamut from picture books for little children and middle grades graphic novels to young adult novels, science fiction novels for adults, many books about tech policy and technopolitics. I work for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I've been with them for nearly 25 years now. They're a nonprofit that works on digital human rights. I've had the great privilege of working alongside some wonderful Brazilian activists from the free software movement and the Telecentros movement. Sergio Amadeo and his staff at the UN were great allies of ours when we were at the World Intellectual Property Organization working on digital rights in copyright treaties. And he was working under the direction of the great Gilberto Gil, who was the culture minister at the time. So I have a lot of respect for and colleagues in Brazil.
I like to start my interviews by letting the people know that here you are allowed to curse as much as you want. So
Sure.
I don't know if you're a very cursy person, but in case you want to, you can. And so we can get to know you a little bit better. We would like to know what's your most used curse word?
It's probably pretty vanilla. I probably say either fuck or shit more than any of the others. I live with a British person. My wife is British, and British people use a word that other Anglophones do not use, unless maybe they're from Australia or New Zealand. A word that starts with C, and every now and again she'll bust one of those out, and it's always surprising.
I have interviewed Adrian Tchaikovsky, the British author, and he said that the word that he used a lot is bloody. That is he said it's very British.
Yeah, I don't think bloody even qualifies as a curse. It's really.
Yeah, he said the same thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so we can get to know you a little bit better. We would like to know what was your gateway into the science fiction genre. What was the movie, the TV show, the book that got you into that made you feel like you needed more of that?
It was really a person, not a piece of media. So I grew up in Toronto in the 1980s and 70s, like all the best Americans. I'm a Canadian, and in Toronto, we were very lucky at that time to have the closest thing I think the world has ever seen to a formal apprenticeship for science fiction writers, and it was all because of one woman, a great writer, editor, and critic named Judith Merrill. And Judy had been married to Frederick Pohl, who's another great science fiction writer. And their divorce coincided with the Chicago police riots in 1968, a moment very familiar today where the American law enforcement apparatus were acting with impunity to brutalize people who were demanding an end to a genocidal war, and where they for the first time attacked the press. And so the whole world got to see what they were doing because the press had been very deferential to them. But once they started swinging batons at the reporters put it all on the news. And Judy, like many Americans, was very shocked, and she decided she couldn't bring up her kids in America, and she went into self-imposed exile. She moved to Canada, and she brought along the books. And she donated those books to the Toronto Public Library System, and they formed the nucleus of what's now the largest science fiction reference collection in the world, called the Spaced Out Library back then. Eventually, Judy let us name it after her. It's now called the Merrill Collection. And she was the writer in residence at that library. She got all kinds of weird gigs. I kind of knew her because my dad was involved with radical politics, and he knew her through radical politics. And when my mom was at teacher's college and my dad was at home with me and my baby brother, we would watch Doctor Who on public television. And Judy had the gig of introducing Doctor Who every week on TV Ontario, where she would describe the origin of the ideas in each night's episode, having been a figure in science fiction of some import since its beginning. She was there and was involved many times with the creation of familiar tropes and ideas in science fiction. And so I knew who she was. And when I was about 10 years old, we took a trip to her library with school. And she came out and she said, look, kids, if you write stories, you can bring them to me and I will critique them for you and help you make them better, which, it's a remarkable offer to be making to a group of young children when you were someone of the stature of Judith Merrill. And I took her up on it. I had a subway pass and I would take the subway down to her library and I would bring her my stories. And I did that for many years. And Judy had a way that she would deal with these writers who would come to her. Is she would put them together. And so she would take writers who are writing at about the same level and put them in workshops, and she would give them space to meet at the library and a day to meet and a time. And she would teach them how to do critiquing circles. And she'd be like, okay, you're in the back room on Tuesdays and these guys are here on Wednesdays and whatnot. And so I found myself in a workshop with some really wonderful writers. It's still going. It's called the Cecil Street Workshop. And, its alumni include Carl Schrader and David Nichol and Madeline Ashby, Peter Watts, Alan Weiss, many other writers over the years. Really who's who of Toronto science fiction. But not only that, I went to a great alternative high school and I spent 7 years getting a 4-year diploma. And one of the reasons I stuck around for so many years was that they had a brilliant writing workshop taught by this teacher, Harriet Wolfe. It was so good that she had to move it to an after-school workshop because kids from all over Toronto would want to come down and be a part of this workshop. And after I didn't want to graduate, I wanted to stay in this workshop. And at one point I was talking about Judy with Harriet, and she said, oh, Judy founded this workshop. Like 10 years before you got to high school, there was a writer in the schools program that had a grant, and she came by and she started the workshop here. I worked at a science fiction bookstore. Well, first I was a customer of this science fiction bookstore called Baca. It's the oldest science fiction bookstore left in the world. And then eventually I got a job there. I worked there for many years. And it turns out that bookstore was founded when Judy bullied a local fan into starting a science fiction bookstore. I also sold my first story to a Canadian science fiction magazine called On Spec. And it turns out that On Spec was founded by two fans from Western Canada who Judy arm twisted into starting a Canadian science fiction magazine. I edited one volume of a long-running anthology series called Tesseracts of Canadian science fiction. That's a series that Judy founded. When I lived in Toronto, I used to go to these every 6 weeks, movable feast, potluck dinners that called Toronto Hydra for all the science fiction professionals, writers, editors, critics, illustrators, filmmakers, TV producers, and so on. Judy started that too. And then eventually the public broadcaster started a wonderful science fiction TV show about the literature, about the field, called Prisoners of Gravity that I consulted on. And that wasn't started by Judy, but it was started by the people who'd brought Judy in to do Doctor Who, whom Judy had convinced could do more with the field than just airing science fiction TV shows. They could talk about the field itself as a literature and as an industry. And so, as I say, no place before or since has ever had something as close to a formal apprenticeship for science fiction writers. I was just really in the right place at the right time. And, 30 books later, I'm still a great admirer of Judy's writing and her editing, but I think her legacy is really going to be her mentorship, her ability to convene. And, today I'm very privileged to be a volunteer on the board of directors of her library. And I think about her all the time.
Well, here's my thank you to Judy. I didn't have the chance to get to know you, but it's obvious from what you said that she impacted a lot of science fiction around the world.
Yeah.
So as a fan, I never knew of her, and now I'm gonna have to look it up.
Yeah.
Usually when I do this interview, I like to start telling the person that I'm talking to that I like to engage in political conversation. Thankfully, that's not the case with you. I don't have to make any disclaimers. That's one of the reasons why I love your work. Because you're an author that tackles political issues in your fiction head on. You're not afraid to talk about it. That's actually what you do. And I don't know how much you follow these conversations online, but there's a group of pretty much conservative nerds, that they like to argue that the old school stuff was good because it was apolitical, because the books before, the cartoons before, the video games before our time, they didn't have politics in it, so that's why they were so good. And now, because of the woke agenda, things are trash. So I would like to know, first of all, if you think that it's possible to create art completely detached of politics, and if maybe if it's possible, I don't think it is, but maybe you think it is. Uh, it that's Do you think that they have a point?
Well, they definitely don't have a point. I mean, anyone who says that science fiction used to be apolitical knows nothing about science fiction. Asimov was investigated by the FBI for his ties to the Communist Party. John W. Campbell, the defining editor of the so-called golden age of science fiction, was a far-right troll who insisted that writers rewrite their fiction to suit his agenda. For example, there's a very famous story called The Cold Equations that Campbell edited. And in The Cold Equations, we meet a spaceship pilot who is delivering vaccines to a planet where there's an out-of-control plague, and everyone on the planet is going to die unless he gets there with the vaccines. And the man is part of the way across the vast distance of space when he realizes that he's burning fuel more quickly than he should. And he looks around his spaceship and he finds a stowaway, a young girl who's stowed away on his ship and is going there to this other planet to see her brother who's there. She doesn't know about the plague. And he says, well, the problem is that with your mass on the ship, there won't be enough fuel to land it. And everyone on the planet is going to die as a result. And so because of this math, because of these cold equations, I have to stick you out the airlock and you have to die. And this is a very famous story. And it's the original facts don't care about your feelings story. And the thing is, the author of this story came up with 4 versions where he figured out how the girl could live. And John W. Campbell kept sending it back to him because John W. Campbell wanted a story about how a foolish girl who stows away on a spaceship deserves to die. And it's impossible to overstate the influence John W. Campbell had on the field. There are 2 major awards in the field named after him, one for Best Short Story and one for Best New Writer. I've won both of those awards. I'm the only writer in the history of the field to have won both Campbell Awards. So I consider myself qualified to speak about John Campbell. He was a fucking fascist. And he wasn't just a fascist. He was a fascist who was a powerful editor who insisted on fascist politics in his work. I mean, anyone who's read Heinlein, one of the defining authors of the so-called Golden Age, couldn't deny that Heinlein was a political writer. But Heinlein's most embarrassingly political book, a book called Fifth Column, that's a yellow peril novel about Chinese communists taking over America and raping white women. That novel was commissioned by John W. Campbell, and all of the plot beats were sketched by John W. Campbell, and John W. Campbell rode herd on Heinlein to stop him from softening any of them because it was an explicitly political work. So anyone who says that science fiction didn't used to be political is not only full of shit, but like saying things that the writers that they admire wouldn't recognize, right? If you went back and asked Heinlein, are you writing political work? He would have said, of course I am, right? If you asked Bradbury, are you a political writer? He would say, of course I am. If you asked Asimov, are there politics in your work? He would say, are you blind? Of course there's politics in my work. So these people, they don't know what they're talking about, right? Like this is, as the physicists say, it's not even wrong, right? Like it's just nonsense. And so that's the first part. As to whether it's possible not to have politics, I guess it depends on what you mean by politics. I mean, like a definition of politics that says politics is the thing that you do to avert violence in resolving conflicts, right? And so by that definition, if your characters ever settle any dispute except by like beating the shit out of each other, you have a political novel, right? I mean, I think a lot about the division between right and left politics. And I've collected a lot of definitions. There's another guy called Cory Robin, who wrote a book called The Reactionary Mind, where he proposes a definition of right-wing politics, or rather a test for right-wing politics. He says, you ask someone, what's more important, human rights or property rights? And if the person answers property rights are a human right, then they're on the right. And if you believe that property rights are one tool that can be used to attain human rights, but not a human right in and of themselves, then you're on the left, right? So a way to translate that into something realistic, if you live in a city with 1 million homeless people and 1 million empty flats, and you don't just take the flats and let the homeless people move into them, then you're not a leftist, right? A leftist says that property rights are subsidiary to human rights, that your property right to throw, well, to use an example from today's news, America's property right to incinerate tens of millions of tons of food aid is less important than the human rights of the people who will starve as a result. And someone should just go take that goddamn food, right? That's the difference between left and right. And I think that there are lots of politics that express, or lots of science fiction, especially science fiction from the so-called golden age, that elevates property rights to a human right and tries to paint a picture of a libertarian voluntaristic society where we all have these property rights that arise out of sort of this Lockean relationship where we find something that exists in a state of nature, we mix it with our labor, and then it becomes our property, and then we trade it with other people. And through a system of sort of human selfishness, we create human abundance. Each person looks out for their own self-interest, and in so doing, creates the best deal for everyone. What a neoliberal economist anyway would call a Pareto optimal outcome. And that is a model of many online societies. We also see, or rather science fictional societies, we also see a lot of authoritarian science fictional societies. A lot of both in the micro and the macrocosm. So back to Heinlein, you have Farnham's Freehold, which is a novel organized around many things, including some very ugly race politics. But in the first act, it's organized around this idea of lifeboat politics, which is, I believe it's attributable to Garrett Hardin, who was a fraudster who came up with the term the tragedy of the commons in a paper he published in Nature, where he invented a history of communally held resources that had been despoiled because they didn't have individual property rights. And so each person overused them. This turns out not to be like a real thing. Elinor Ostrom later won the Nobel Prize in Economics for studying how actual commons works. And it looks nothing like Garrett Hardin's idea. Hardin was a racist and a eugenicist. He was a Malthusian who thought that brown people were going to outbreed white people, and who advocated for things like forced sterilization of people in the global south. And he believed that the coming population bomb was an emergency, and that in an emergency, authoritarian tactics are not only justified, but necessary. And Heinlein contrived so many circumstances in Farnham's Freehold in which it is absolutely necessary for the protagonist, Hugh Farnham, who is a libertarian, who believes in personal freedom above all other values, to give orders to other people and threaten to murder them if they don't listen to his orders. And Heinlein, it's an extremely political exercise, right? So, I mean, I think it's impossible to overstate just how stupid it is to say that old science fiction didn't have politics in it. I really do.
No, I agree with you. And yeah, that's a discussion that I mostly see online. And I do think it's very dumb. And it's hard because they usually, these groups, they're well organized, and they just, it's hard to reach them in some sorts. But we're going to talk about reaching people.
Well, so look, there's a famous quote, I think it's William Morris, you cannot reason someone out of a belief they didn't reason their way into. So, these people don't think this because they've engaged in rational thought or study. They think it because it makes them feel more comfortable to think this, that what they enjoyed in older science fiction was not politics, and what they dislike about new science fiction is politics.
Yeah.
But it's not a reasoned belief.
Yeah. It's well, and that's something that I don't know because I was the type of science fiction fan that I wouldn't have many friends that read science fiction, and I've been having a lot of contact with communities through the internet. So I don't know if this was a phenomenon that happened before the internet, or the internet created it. But now we see a bunch of people that create these groups that are dedicated exclusively on attacking pop culture media that they see as, well, whatever that means. Well, it's
Sure.
yeah. Well, I don't know how things are where you live, but here in Brazil we have this. Sadly, we have this popular notion that science fiction and fantasy literature are, well, commercial literature. It's not real literature, and I don't know how it is over there, but I wanted to, I wanted to hear you talk about what does science fiction have to say about our reality, our politics, and why choose it as a tool to critique and debate.
Well, I think science fiction is a very broad literature, and like other forms of literature, there are people who write with remarkable plainness, where that plainness disguises enormous skill, and it is the plainness that comes from confidence. And there are people who write very elliptically, very beautifully. And there are people who write in every way in between. It's true that science fiction's roots are in pulp literature, and I like being a pulp writer. Pulp literature tends to foreground the plot. A lot of stuff happens in pulp literature. And I think that having a lot of stuff happen in your work is a great way to keep people engaged while you engage with all the other stuff that art does. Exposing and exploring moral conundra and so on. I think the point of art, all art, is to take a big, numinous, irreducible, complex feeling that is taken up residence in the mind of a creative worker, to have that creative worker then try and imbue that feeling into some intermediary form, a dance choreography, a poem, a novel, a movie, a song, a painting, a photo, in the hopes that when someone in the public encounters this work, that some facsimile of that big, numinous, irreducible feeling will appear in their minds. Right? That's what art is, I think. And seen in that light, art is in some ways a game of engaging the attention of the audience in a sustained and close enough manner that the transmission of that big, irreducible, numinous, complex feeling can take place. And plot is a great way to engage people's attention. And so it's not the only way, but it's a great way of doing it. So I think that's why pulp is fun to write and fun to read, is that it's a great way to convey a lot of complex and nuanced things without the audience even necessarily noticing it. And the easier it goes down, the more of it you can do, right? It's true that you can use this method to convey very trivial things, right? Movies are very good at this. So movies, because of the writer's room structure, they hew to a very well-turned, well-crafted plotting templates that engage the viewer's attention even when there's nothing much of substance going on. And it's very possible to watch a whole movie and have very little come out of it. But by the same token, if you've got such a powerful engine of attentional commanding as you can with a pulp novel, there's a lot of freight you can put behind that engine, right? You can put many complicated ideas and scenarios and conundra and ethical questions in there. As to what science fiction does separate from pulp literature more broadly, I think that there are people who make the mistake of thinking that science fiction is about predicting the future or even really about the future. I think regrettably there are a few science fiction writers who make this mistake and believe themselves to be some kind of fortune teller. I don't think that's what science fiction does, and I don't think it's possible to do that. And I'm very glad, because if the future is predictable, then it's inevitable. And if it's inevitable, then what we do doesn't matter, right? A predictable future is a future with no human agency in it, because we change things. We're not billiard balls whose motion is determined by the strike of the cue ball. We have volition, and the world changes based on what we do. And I think that so much of what goes on in our technological society is sold to us as inevitable, right? As teleological. Mark Zuckerberg wants you to think that it's impossible for you to have a conversation with your friends without him spying on you from asshole to appetite while you do it. And when you tell him you don't want that to happen, he like looks at you like, you've just said something incomprehensible, right? Like, sure, I know you don't want me to spy on you while you talk to your friends, but like, let's be realistic here. That's like asking for water that's not wet, right? The spying and the talking to your friends, they're just connected to each other. And there are some things in the computer that are connected to each other, right? Like making data that's harder to copy. That's like making water that's not wet. I mean, we spent years during the Napster wars trying to explain this to people, right? Like, computers that can't copy data are off, right? Like, the only way for a computer to work is to copy data. That's what a computer is. It's a thing that moves bits around. And it's what the internet is. The internet can't show you a thing without copying the thing hundreds of times before you see it. That's just like how it works. But they like to do that. They like to make statements like this about things that are divisible, that are separable, to insist that this is the only way it could work. And this is a trick of the right, broadly. Margaret Thatcher was famous for repeating, "There is no alternative." She said this so often that people called her Tina. There is no alternative. And what she meant was, stop trying to think of an alternative, right? Like it's a demand dressed up as a rule, as an observation, right? Not there is no alternative, but if you would only stop thinking of alternatives, then we could do it my way. Lifeboat rules, right? Shut up and do as you're told. That's what there is no alternative means. And what science fiction does is it exposes the contingency of our technological arrangements by insisting that the most important thing about a technology is not what it does, but who it does it for and who it does it to. And by imagining 100 ways in which those can be reconfigured. And that's very exciting, because the difference between utopia and dystopia is rarely the operating characteristics of the device. It is the social arrangements. The same advanced computer vision system that warns you if your car is drifting out of your lane and stops you from having an accident can also telephone your insurance company so they can add $10 to your bill this month because you drifted out of your lane. And whether it does one or the other is a social factor. It's not a technological one, right? Whether your calendar reminds you of what's going on or lets the police find out whether you have been near a big protest against the government, that's a thing that is socially determined, not technologically determined. And science fiction thinks of 6 alternatives before breakfast. I have a colleague who's a great science fiction writer, but also an incredible polymath. Her name is Ada Palmer. And Ada, she's written this incredible tetralogy of novels, the Terra Ignota novels, and a new book about Renaissance history, because she is a tenured professor of Renaissance history at the University of Chicago, where she specializes in information control during the Inquisitions, especially in Florence, and especially material related to homosexuality, witchcraft, heresy, pornography, and so on. Ada, also, she's a librettist and a singer. She's written many operas. You can find her music. She plays in a band called Sassafras. I recommend a song she's written that's so incredible that just mentioning it, I started to choke up there, called Someone Will. That's just such a beautiful song. And she's famous at the University of Chicago, where she teaches, because every year she leads her undergraduates in a 4-week-long live-action role-playing game in which they reenact the election of the Medici's Pope. So it's conclave. And she has these Google alerts for theater companies that are selling off their costumes. And she's got enough outfits that everyone dresses up. And they spend 4 weeks. They get a character sheet telling them, which cardinal they are or which power player they are, how they're related to everyone else, and where their sources of power are. And they spend 4 weeks betraying each other, making deals, breaking deals. And then there's this fake Gothic cathedral on campus at the University of Chicago. And they go into this cathedral dressed as cardinals. And they elect a pope. And every year of the final 4 candidates for the pope, 2 have always been the same, because they come from the great and powerful families. And the other 2 have never once been the same, because what people do matters. And she used this as an exercise to teach her undergraduates that history is contingent, that teleology is bunk, right? That what we do matters. It's an incredible exercise. And I think only a historian who's also a science fiction writer could have thought of it. And this is what science fiction is. This is why alternate history is a science fiction genre, right? What does alternate history have to do with science fiction? If you think of science fiction as a futuristic literature, right? Alternate history is a way of reiterating the science fictional premise that history is contingent, that things change based on human agency, that for the want of a nail, the shoe is lost, right? And so, our literature is it's a very powerful tonic when we are confronted by people who repeat the bully's mantra, I wish I didn't have to do this, but I have no choice. Because like the writer who John W. Campbell kept telling to stick the girl out the airlock, we can think of solutions. We don't have to be barbarians.
While preparing myself for this interview, I've noticed something, and maybe it was my perception of it, but I think that sometimes the people that you're talking to get shocked by how simple the mechanics of our current dystopian reality is, because you often talk about, especially when you talk about the power of the big corporation lies on the monopolies, and people like to think that there's a secret behind it, the algorithm, like it's some type of sorcery. And sometimes when I hear you talk to people, I maybe, again, it may be my interpretation, but I feel some discomfort, because I think it's kind of reassuring to assume that there's something secret about it, like, something that we don't know. But it's kind of obvious that they have a bunch of money, they own a bunch of the companies, they own how you get information and stuff like that. So it's monopoly. That's pretty much it. And seeing the grim of the situation and how bad it kind of looks, I like what you do in some of your books, especially talking about choke point capitalism and enshittification, that even in the title of your book, you imply that there's something that we can do. And both the books and the title, there's a final part of what can you do about it, or what can we do to change it. Actually, I'm going to digress a bit here. This is the Brazilian copy, and I have a complaint because the title changes. The final part, what can you do about it, is not in the Brazilian copy. The Brazilian copy says how the oligarchies, corporative, choke the creative markets, and that's it. The final part, it's not in the Brazilian copy. Well, that's I'm gonna talk to the publishers about this. But anyway,
I've never seen that edition, by the way. That's quite cool.
Yeah, here it is, and it's an amazing book. But I like how you talk about these issues as there's hope. There's something that we can do. So
sure.
I would like for you to tell us, how do you feel that it's possible to keep hope without being naive about it? How not to fall into despair, everything sucks, we can do nothing to change it, we just have to accept it. The bully says so, I'm gonna do so. How we don't get to fall into that, but how can we accept the reality without being, I don't know, too grim or too naive about it?
Sure. So when you were speaking, I looked up a quote from a colleague of mine, Matthew Stoller, who wrote this week about the Epstein stuff, which is going on here, and about the far right, conspiratorial right. And he said something in this that I was really important. He said, MAGA supporters need a giant spider web of myths to believe in order to explain a world that is deeply unfair. The anti-monopoly movement doesn't need such myths. We understand that neoliberal economists and a set of policymakers changed the law in the 1970s. But that's not how the right understands power, because they fundamentally do not believe that any institutions with collective meaning, such as the law, can be trustworthy. Right? So that it's a long-winded way of saying something that they used to say in Germany in the 19th century, which is that they called anti-Semitism the socialism of fools. Right? If you observe that there's a small number of very rich people who seem to have all the power in the world, and you are not a fool, you go, oh, this is a system. It's a system for allowing people who get a little power to get more power and get all the power and then keep the power. And if you're a fool, you say it's the Jews. And I can add here just defensively some perhaps that I am Jewish, although I am not a Zionist, and I want an end to the genocide in Gaza and war crimes tribunals for the people responsible for it. And so I think that if you understand the causal nature of the policies that are making us so miserable, right? If you understand the that specific policies were chosen, that the people at the time were told what would the likely outcome be of them, that they did them anyway, and that now we're living in the outcome that was predicted, then you still are looking at a very broken and terrible world. But at least you have a sense of what needs to be done. You need to reverse the policies. Right. So back to there is no alternative. We stopped enforcing anti-monopoly laws in the late 1970s all over the world. Less so in Latin America, but the people who were backed by the CIA in staging right-wing coups were also very monopoly friendly. So eventually all over the world, you got this tolerance for and celebration of monopolies that gained steam in the years that followed. And monopolies, they concentrate power in a small number of hands. Monopolists can be efficient, right? They can organize everything under one roof, and that can be very efficient, but they are undisciplined, because if they make mistakes or if they give in to their worst impulses, they don't face punishment from competitors. And they don't face punishment from regulators, because monopolies are too big to fail and too big to jail, which makes them too big to care. And so we have these policies. The people who enacted the pro-monopoly policies, which were in reaction to anti-monopoly policies that kicked off around 1890, around the time of the robber barons, when we were going through every 15 to 20 years, massive stock market crashes, just hugely unstable situation politically, rising authoritarianism, and so on. So you got the trust busters who created the antitrust movement and the antitrust laws and enforced them, broke up Standard Oil, broke up the trusts, and so on. The pro-monopoly people were told what would happen. They said we would get, even if they thought monopolies could be efficient, that the monopolies, however efficient they were at the outset, would become corrupt and unaccountable, and would ruin our politics and ruin our civil life and ruin the lives of the people who depended on them for goods and jobs and so on, and eventually destroy the world. And they ignored it. And today, they insist that all the trouble we're having is unrelated to their policies. So I sometimes analogize this to, in the 1970s, we didn't have rats because we put down rat poison. And these guys came along and they said, let's stop putting down rat poison. And they won the argument. We stopped putting down rat poison. And today, we're all having our faces eaten off by rats. And when we go to these guys and we say, hey, your pro-rat policies resulted in a lot of rats, they go, well, how can you be sure that it's our policies, right? Maybe it's sunspots. maybe the great forces of history bore down on this moment to make rats very fecund, right? Maybe it's, maybe it's an exogenous factor. And sure, admittedly, the rats did buy all the rat poison factories and shut them down, but that's just economically rational. If we're not going to put down rat poison anymore, what do we need the rat poison factories for? Right? So I think that once you understand the nature of the trick that was pulled on us, that it can be a source of hope in as much as you know what part of the machine is broken. It doesn't tell you how to fix it, and it can be really hard to fix it. There's a joke from Eastern Canada that the punchline is, if you wanted to get there, I wouldn't start from here, right? It's much easier to prevent monopoly formation than to police monopolies once they're formed, because they're very powerful at that stage. One example of this, one of the monopolies that the trustbusters left intact was IBM, because they were very important to the US military. And over again, the US military intervened to keep IBM intact. But by 1970, IBM's conduct had been so odious and so bad for the American tech sector, because they were just using monopolistic tactics, crushing every potential competitor, every innovator, just keeping computers like mired in the 1960s, that the US Department of Justice brought an antitrust case against them. So in 1970, they brought this case. And for the next 12 consecutive years, IBM spent more on lawyers to fight the DOJ than the DOJ spent on all the lawyers fighting all the antitrust cases in America. They outspent the US government, not for 1 year, but for 12 consecutive years. They call it antitrust's Vietnam. And at the end of this 12-year period, they ran out the clock because Ronald Reagan got elected and dropped the case against them, right? So that's why you want to prevent monopolies from forming, because monopolies are ungovernable. And so they have to, and libertarians should understand this, right? Even if you want, they call it the night watchman state, right? The cop who enforces contracts. That's all you want the state to do. The state still has to be more powerful than the entities whose contracts it's enforcing, right? The referee has to be more powerful than the players on the field. If the referee can't boss the players around, then what's the referee doing, right? So the largest state you can have, or the smallest state you can have, is determined by the largest corporation you're willing to have. The state has to be bigger than your biggest corporations or cartels. And so this is something that even libertarians should be able to understand, and they don't. And the reason they don't is the same reason so many libertarians love Heinlein novels, where his character points a gun at someone and gives them orders, and they say, "Oh, well, this is personal liberty," Hope is the ability to imagine a step that you can take that will materially improve your circumstances. Because if you can materially improve your circumstances, even just a little, you might be able to see some other step you can take that is obscure right now. That as you ascend the gradient towards the future you want to live in, you are gaining a higher and higher vantage point from which you can see terrain that's invisible from this lower spot that you're at. And so just because you can't see the way from A to Z, it doesn't mean that the path doesn't exist. It means that it has to be discovered in a stepwise fashion. And sometimes you might hit a dead end. You might have to go back down a bit and then go back up some more. But hope is the precondition for the motion that allows you to discover the path through the crisis that you're in. This doesn't make me happy, right? There's a difference between being hopeful and happy. I just came off a 24-city book tour with my last novel, Picks and Shovels. And everywhere I went, because it was, during the worst of the first 100 days of Trump, which just keep getting worse, Yeah. And everywhere I went, people said, "How do you keep your spirits up?" And I kept thinking about this joke about the man who goes to see a psychologist. And he says, "Doctor, I'm so depressed. I just can't deal with it anymore." And the shrink says, "Well, I've got wonderful news for you. The great clown Pagliacci is in town tonight. And everyone who goes to a show comes out with a smile on his face." And the man says, "But doctor, I am Pagliacci." I don't know how to be happy right now. I don't know how to feel good right now, but I know how to stay moving. right? You look for the thing that you can do that will materially improve your circumstances the most, right? The step you can take that will bring you furthest up the gradient towards the world you want to live in. And you do that. And then you do the next thing. Because when you get there, you will be able to see terrain that you can't see from where you're at right now.
Well, I'm gonna, talking about that a little bit, because I'm a child of progressive parents as well. My parents were both politically engaged. They were both in the left, and I always considered myself left wing. But I wasn't like very active on it. I would vote left, and that was kind of it. But during the pandemic here, you in the US had Trump, but we had Bolsonaro, which is pretty crappy as well. And
Tropical Trump.
yeah, exactly. And all these circumstances that we had, it kind of made me very angry. I was very angry that I wasn't feeling safe, that I had to work, that the vaccines weren't coming, a bunch of stuff happening that got me angry and frustrated. And I decided that I needed to do something. So I started to mobilize. I looked into political groups from close by, and I started to engage. And I've been doing so for the last 4 or 5 years. And
That's very good.
yeah, I'm very happy about it. And relating to what you said, I found that my anger, even though it's still there, it kind of, all of this brought hope as well. The feeling that I was doing something, even though it was small, it kind of gave me the sensation that hope was near me. And being with other people that felt the same way as I did, and starting to getting organized and talking to other people that felt anger but not hope yet, it kind of became a cycle for me. And I wanted to know from you, because you also were the child of parents that are left wing. What was what happened that radicalized you, or what was the thing that made you think, well, I'm gonna write books that talk about this political stuff?
I mean, look, it's the same as what got me into science fiction. I read science fiction all my life. I was around people like Judy Merrill, who were, political science fiction writers. Judy was part of a group called the Futurians, who lived in a communal polyamorous house in New York. And the Futurians had the distinction of being banned from attending the first Hugo banquet for being too left wing. So it was really something. So I just, the idea that literature would be a way to express my politics was always a big part of my of the way that I thought of the literature, and one of the reasons I love the literature. I even love it when it's politics that I disagree with. I find it very interesting to read political work that where I don't agree with the politics. Like, I find it very interesting to read Heinlein, for example, who I think at his best was a very good writer. And one of the reasons I don't like Ayn Rand and make a lot of jokes at her expense is I think she was a shitty writer, right? And I am always interested in how people use art to create political messages, and just how politics are practiced more broadly, including by people I really disagree with. I think people don't listen to Trump enough, and by that I mean listen to the way he speaks. Because when you read a transcript or when you just get it clipped, it sounds stupid. But I think Trump should be best understood when he's in his flow as being something like a comedian or performance artist, right? And he's very good when he's in his flow. He's got a good ear for the audience. He can hear the audience responding to what he says, and he can adjust his patter in real time. This is part of his secret. And I think we should watch him. I think we should listen to him sometimes, not all the time, but I think it's you shouldn't dismiss him, because, we've had people who were orators who, if you laid out what they said all in a row, it didn't make much sense, but who their oratory taken as a totality was inspiring. And it doesn't, language is not math. My dad's a math professor, so I know what math is, and language is not math. One of the things that scolds say to English speakers, although I think not to Romance language speakers, is that you can't use a double negative. No way, no how am I going to go? I didn't hear nothing, right? Well, a double negative, it's not math. It's not a positive. It's an intensifier, right? I don't speak much Portuguese, but in Spanish, or you could say like no hay ningunas, no hay nada, nada y ningunas y no quiero y nadie tampoco, right? Like you can just pile up the intensifiers, right? And
I'm actually from El Salvador. I live in Brazil, but I'm from El Salvador, so I speak Spanish as well. So yeah, I get you.
Yeah, and it's the same in French, and it's the same in which I speak a little of because we have to take it in Canada. And so, I think that like Trump's political speech, even though you can't lay it out and diagram the sentences, is effective, and I think we fail to listen to it at our own peril.
Well, talking about how you got into science fiction and politics and stuff like that, I think about how your work in Pirate Cinema and Little Brother, I feel like they explore youth, and I think that you kind of argue about how we should let young people be active agents, something that we as a society not very often do. I don't feel like we always encourage young people to have opinions and to act on it. We usually dismiss it as foolish, and as well, they're learning. They'll be where I am, so it's stupid, but they'll grow, and we see them as blank slates that we can mold. And I was thinking about it because now in my 35 years old, I kind of sometimes catch myself being paternalistic toward younger people. I feel like, I did that, or I see some new trend that I don't quite get, and I kind of dismiss it. And I try to police myself so I don't make that as much, because I don't think that's a healthy behavior. I don't like to tell young people what to do. And well, I wanted to see what your take on is on how to grow older without becoming conservative, because I feel like even the left-wing people, they kind of have this conservative behavior, like, oh,
sure,
you're too radical because you're young, you don't know what to do, you need to see the establishment and stuff like that. So I think that even the left-wing people, they kind of tend to be conservative toward young people, and they don't listen to them as much.
Yeah, so young people can be first-rate reasoners. And this is how you get things like chess prodigies or math prodigies. But what they are not is they are not people who have a lot of context. And that's just a function of age. That's why you don't have 6-year-old MDs or historians, right? Math is a thing where if you know a few simple rules, you can build up a whole complex edifice of knowledge. Same with physics, same with chess. Medicine, history, you need to read more books than you have time to read, even if you're a very fast reader at 6. And so that's the thing. That's the major difference between young people and old people, is context. But context can confound, because two things can look similar but be different. I every now and again I go through these phases where I get really interested in conjuring, stage magic, and one of the foundational aspects of stage magic is that a good conjurer will know 5 or 6 ways to produce the same effect. And they will do what looks to you like the same trick 6 times in a row, but it's 6 different tricks. So they'll say, like, I can pull the king out of the deck, and they'll pull the king out of the deck, and they'll go, you didn't see how I did it? Watch closely. And you got an idea of how they did it because you saw them do it once, and maybe you saw, a little thing. They do a different trick that produces the king, right? So they can do that 6 times in a row. And you will be completely baffled because every intuition you have is wrong. In the world, you can have 2 situations that seem very similar, but in retrospect, you'll discover that they were really different. right? The authoritarianism of Trump 1 and the authoritarianism of Trump 2, they're different, right? We need different tactics for them. The lie of the land is different. And so young people are, on the one hand, not blessed by context, but they're not burdened by it either. And to be a little Marxist about this, that's the dialectic, right? Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. There's a poem that I really like by John Ciardi, who's an Italian-American poet who, among other things, is my favorite translator of Dante. But he wrote a book of doggerel, basically, called Fast and Slow. And the title poem is called About Crows. And it goes, the old crow is getting slow. The young crow is not. Of what the young crow does not know, the old crow knows a lot. And knowing things, the old crow is still the young crow's master. What does the old crow not know? How to go faster. The young crow flies above, below, and rings around the slow old crow. What does the fast young crow not know? Where to go. And, I'm old. I'm tired. I had both my hips replaced. I had eye surgery last year for my cataracts. I've just had my cancer treated. I'm slow. And I used to be much more tireless. When I was EFF's European director at 30 some years, I was on the road 28 days a month. I didn't keep my fridge plugged in because it cost me $10 a month to keep my ice cubes frozen. And I couldn't do that today. But I got a lot done. I didn't do it as efficiently as I would have done it today, but I had a lot of energy, and I really benefited from being around older people who told me when I was full of shit and listened when I told them that I wasn't.
Talking about because usually most of the people that listen to me, they're kind of politically engaged, but most of them, they like the sci-fi aspect of it. That's how I usually talk about stuff. And I wanted to have the opportunity to hear you on maybe what can we science fiction fans, fantasy fans, literature fans, comic book fans, what do you think that we can do, maybe in a small scale, to be part of the change, to maybe help? Maybe you something that we discuss a lot on the organization that I'm part of is that a bunch of us work. We don't have a lot of time to dedicate ourselves, but some of us can, and maybe we can help the ones that can do their work better. But what do you think that we, as if you're maybe someone that enjoys science fiction, how can you help change our reality or be a part of the change that we wish to see?
So I think that if you can use your and your fellow science fiction fans' experience with the field and enchantment with its literature as the framework for discussing the contingency of the world around you and the ability of things to change. There's that Ursula Le Guin quote that at one point the divine right of kings seemed unassailable. That nothing came down off a mountain on 2 stone tablets. Harry Seldon was a charlatan. The future can't be predicted. It can be shaped. And remember that as science fiction fans, that anyone who tells you that it must be this way, that this is the only way to use AI, or this is the only way to use a CCTV camera, or this is the only way to organize a database, or a high-tech police department, right? That this is nonsense, that there is always an alternative. If you can make that the top of the funnel for organizing conversations that you have with your normie friends, just say, like, I don't know if you've ever studied organizing conversations. These are things that structured conversations, union organizers use them. And it's a structured conversation. It's a thing that you learn to do as a union organizer, where you talk to a fellow worker and you start by listening very carefully and talking about your shared experience and their grievances, and then you work your way through to the causes. You can have structured conversations about the contingency of the past and the future and our ability to shape it. and the theft of our future that goes on when people say that it can only be one way. You can have those structured conversations with your science fiction friends who are political normies and turn them into politicos. I'd say that that's probably a pretty productive thing to do.
Thankfully, that was my last question, actually.
Oh, very good.
First of all, thank you very much for agreeing to this interview. It was a big privilege for me to have this opportunity to talk to you, and I'm sure that your Brazilian fans are also going to enjoy it as well. These are a couple of your Brazilian
very good,
fans as well. Pirate Cinema and Little Brother over here.
Yeah.
So
I'm told I have Brazilians of fans.
Yeah, you do. You actually do. And first, so we can wrap it up, and I don't have to take a lot of your time. I would like for you just to send a message for your Brazilian fans.
Even when you don't have hope, don't have joy, have hope, and that's where you'll find your joy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cory, and thank you for everyone that stayed till this long. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.